Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for Trust Yourself with Melody Welding. My name is Isis Torres. I'm the event production manager at the NASDAQ Entrepreneur Center. For those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. As you may have seen in the chat, the NASDAQ Entrepreneur Center, along with our partner Mentor Cloud, launched a free mentor matching platform for entrepreneurs called Mentor Makers. You can create your own advisory board to guide and inspire you with in-the-moment mentorship from topic experts and professionals dedicated to providing exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. Together, we will build the greatest exchange of knowledge and expertise in service to entrepreneurs and businesses today. You can find or become a mentor by using the link in the chat. So entrepreneurs are the dreamers, doers, visionaries who are not just solving the problems our community and the world face today, but those that will create a better future for us all. Mentorship matters to all entrepreneurs and their success is dependent on it. Quick housekeeping, we will open up for live Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Of course, none of what we do could be possible without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, BPM, and NZTE. We are humbled by their contributions. During these unique times, we're curious how sentiment is among the entrepreneurs we work with, and we'd like to start by taking a quick poll with two quick questions. The first one will be, how are you feeling, with options as fearful, anxious, surviving, and optimistic. And the second question will be, is what's keeping you up at night? Finance, scale, marketing, sales, pivot, team, or surviving. So I'll go ahead and launch those really quick. And if you can take a moment to fill out how you're feeling and what's keeping you up at night. And answering question number 2 really helps us better understand what types of events and programs you'd like to see in the future. So appreciate you all filling that out there. Give it another second or two, and then I'll go ahead and end that poll and share those results. We have about 54% of the votes coming in. Looks like optimistic is at the top of the lineup there. Super, super excited that we have an optimistic crowd with us here today, and surviving coming in second, which is understandable during this time. And for what's keeping us up at night, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll, share those results so you guys can see what I'm seeing. What's keeping you up at night looks like finance is at the top of our scale there. So we'll definitely look into providing more programming to fit that need. Stop sharing that right now and that poll. And without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm, warm welcome to our special guest, Melody, executive coach and mental performance coach. She's also the author of Trust Yourself, Stop Overthinking, and Channel Your Emotions for Success at Work. Welcome, Melody. We're so excited to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
Awesome. So let's dive right in, Melody. Our first question for you is, we understand your journey is truly unique, and we'd love to learn a little bit more about what drew you to entrepreneurship and how you got to where you are today.
Entrepreneurship is in my blood, literally speaking. I come from generations of entrepreneurs, family that came over to this country and started small businesses, and that was how they got by and built their own American dream. But also very directly, both of my parents were entrepreneurs. So I grew up in family businesses. It was kind of the water I swam in and what I knew as far as a career. I didn't even understand rather that people went to real jobs until, I was a teenager almost. So it was a very natural path for me to take just because it was what I observed so much growing up.
I love that. A family of entrepreneurs.
Yes.
And what was the aha moment that led you to writing Trust Yourself?
Yeah, this book is really the culmination of 10 years of working with high achievers at some of the world's biggest companies, but also startup founders, entrepreneurs, small business owners. And as I have gone throughout my work, I have noted some consistent patterns among my clients. This constellation of challenges that they face that was both coming from being highly sensitive, which is being a deep thinker and feeler, and also being high achieving. We'll talk more about that. But I noticed these recurring challenges, things like imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
overthinking, perfectionism, lack of boundaries. And so, really, the book came about because I wanted to distill the practices, the tools I've shared with my clients over the past 10 years into a roadmap that other people can actually use and apply to advance themselves.
That's amazing. I'm personally very, very excited to dive into the book. You stress in the book that sensitivity is a trait, not a disorder, and in fact is a strength and something that can be a superpower if we know how to use it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so many times we think of sensitivity as a weakness or a flaw. Anybody who is sensitive knows that you are always told to stop being that way, stop taking things so personally. Why don't you grow a thicker skin? So there's definitely this conditioning and this societal messaging that it's not a positive, it's not something you want to be. But what we know from the research is that high sensitivity is a trait, it's a personality trait, just like introversion or extroversion. And about 20% or so of the population has this genetic trait difference that leads to high sensitivity, which is really just another way of saying that you have a more attuned central nervous system. So you're more affected by things that go on within and around you. You're more attuned to other people's emotions. And what's really fascinating is that the research shows that people with high sensitivity have different brain patterns. Their brain processes neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin differently than other people. And certain centers of the brain, particularly ones that are related to processing thoughts, making meaning from situation, awareness, concentration, empathy, all of those actually light up more. There's more activity in those parts of the brain for people who are highly sensitive.
It's so neat. You use the term sensitive strivers in the book, and it's something I think many entrepreneurs identify with, and many of those who are actually in the community with us today. Can you explain what a sensitive striver is and some of the most common challenges they face in the workplace?
A sensitive striver, put really simply, is someone who is both high achieving, as I was saying, and highly sensitive. So you think and feel everything more deeply, but you're also very driven. You put a lot of pressure on yourself to succeed. You set high goals and you achieve them, but maybe sometimes you set too many goals or unrealistic aims for yourself. So that, in a nutshell, is what it means to be a sensitive striver. And as I said, this is a tremendous upside. You're emotionally intelligent, empathetic, conscientious, loyal. But on the downside, most of us are never given tools or even understand that we have these different qualities. So without those tools, we can fall into some of the downsides that this combination has to offer.
Yeah, completely understand that. And what are your tips for helping sensitive strivers help better manage that type of stress so they can be more successful in the workplace environment?
I think one of the biggest things is learning to reframe your thoughts. I know we're going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome, and that's often one of the biggest challenges that people come to me with. But reframing is such a core part of what I work on with my clients because the stories you tell yourself create your reality and guide your actions. So if the story you're telling yourself about the reason why a client isn't responding to one of your emails is that you're horrible, you're cut out for this, maybe you said something stupid in that email, well, it's going to make you much less likely to follow up or to send another email
Right.
or put yourself out there in a certain way. And so reframing is really about how do you constructively shift your thoughts, not to be overly positive, but to be more realistic, helpful, and encouraging.
Awesome. Awesome. And keeping on that topic of sensitive strivers, many of the traits that you were naming a little bit earlier that identify as sensitive strivers are also the traits in the most valuable in the future of work: empathy, communication, etc. How should organizations be thinking about sensitive strivers in their organization to succeed in the future?
hmm Yeah. And just as you were saying, if we look at any future of jobs report, there was one that came out from the World Economic Forum in 2020, last year, that showed that the traits that are going to be most valuable in the workplace are things like complex thinking, problem solving, as you were saying, empathy, communication, working with people, all of the things that people who are sensitive strivers are high in. So, organizations, I am always encouraging people to have very frank and just very upfront conversations about how you work. I think that's one thing that we gloss over. We tend to think, or rather, the workplace is really designed for the other 80% of people. So, we
Right.
as leaders, as managers, do a disservice if we treat all of our employees as a monolith, thinking that they all process information or communicate in the same way. So I have pretty much all of my clients, whether they are an employee, whether they own a company, have a team, put together a personal user manual that really explains, how do you make decisions? How do you like to be communicated with? What are some of your boundaries? What does it look like when you're at your best? What does it look like when you're at your worst? And a lot of this can give insight into that sensitive striver personality and what you need to thrive. But it can help just have a very upfront, clarifying conversation about those things rather than leading to miscommunication down the road.
Yeah, I love that. And I even think of, I think those aren't questions that you are usually asked in the beginning of a job or any of those pieces. And so I think it's super important to outline that in the beginning. So I love that,
Mhm.
those tips. The next question, you touched on it a little bit, and it came up a lot in the pre-submitted questions around imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
And a big challenge for sensitive strivers in the workplace is imposter syndrome, like you mentioned. Can you share more about how founders can really overcome this?
First, let me ground us in what I mean by imposter syndrome, since for
Perfect.
many people it is a newer term. I think it's
Yeah.
become much more popular. But by imposter syndrome, what we're talking about here is that phenomenon of thinking you're a fake, a fraud, that you're incompetent, despite actually being accomplished, despite having started a company or having clients or revenue, for example. You still don't feel like you are legit. So, with imposter syndrome, as with most of the challenges sensitive strivers face, it comes down to managing that internal dialogue. And one of the most helpful things you can do, I talked a little bit about reframing, but a step before that is catching yourself before you go down that negative spiral that imposter syndrome takes you down. One of the best ways to do that is by naming your inner critic, giving it an identity, a persona that is separate from you. And this can be something silly. I call mine Bozo. You might call yours the little gremlin, Cruella de Vil. I've heard all sorts of things. And I would actually love it if people wanted to share theirs in the comments. It's always fun to hear what people come up with to name their inner critic. But this is a very helpful exercise. It may sound minor, but there is a lot of research that points to the effectiveness of this idea of psychologically distancing yourself, because it creates space between your thoughts and your reactions. And when you have that space, you can evaluate whether your thoughts are helpful to you or not, or even realistic. But you also can think, do I want to take a different action here? So it helps unfuse you from that. So you just don't automatically react to that imposter syndrome chatter that's in your head.
I love that. And remind me, it's little Bozo is your inner critic?
Mine is Bozo.
Bozo.
I call it the little monster, gremlin, all sorts of things.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And so you were touching on this again earlier, how emotions have traditionally been something we've been trained to hide at work. But you write that emotions, particularly sensitivity, can again be an asset. How do we turn that emotionality into a competitive advantage?
hmm Yeah. And again, this is another way that we have been conditioned. Keep your emotions out of it. We're told all the time, right? But what we don't realize is that the workplace is made up of humans. And the number one thing that influences humans is emotions. And
Yeah.
so sensitive strivers are actually incredibly effective at sales, marketing, persuasion, all of those aspects of business that require deep understanding of human behavior, how people tick, getting into their shoes of how might this person be feeling? What are their biggest pain points here? How can I solve it for them? What hangups might they have or resistance to, buying this product from me? And so if you can take your emotionality and channel it that way to either influence, inspire, motivate people, it can really make a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're often told to do what makes us happy. And I'm sure many of us on this call have heard this before, but you argue that we should also do what we're well suited for. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I am someone who early on in my career I really struggled with the idea of finding your passion as it was
Yeah.
something you were anointed with. And I really struggled with that because I felt like I didn't have one. And so, what I have found in my own experience, as well as that of my clients, is this idea of doing what you're well suited at. Because when you work with your strengths instead of against them, especially in a professional environment, you actually do experience greater satisfaction because you feel more competent at what you're doing. It seems to come more easily to you. You experience enjoyment and fulfillment from that task, for example. So for sensitive strivers in particular, I can't tell you how many clients I have that are product people, product managers, product leads, who are project managers. And I don't think this is a coincidence or an accident, but because those two roles kind of uniquely combine some of the things that sensitive strivers are best at: organization, conscientiousness, but also a critical, especially product. You really have to be a synthesizer and really looking at needs for the product from different lenses: the customer, sales, marketing. So it's a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I resonate with a lot of that. And to kind of follow up on that, how do you have tips on sharing on understanding what you are best suited at? Like, how do you figure that out so that you can really speak to that strength?
hmm Well, what I always recommend for my clients whenever they're trying to take stock of what their own personal strengths are is a few things. First is to track your energy for 2 weeks or so and literally gather data about what types of tasks give you energy versus what takes it away.
Yeah.
And that can be very enlightening. Maybe you are at your best when you are writing content for your business, but the customer service side of things totally drains you. Whereas somebody else may be really enlivened by sales and getting on the phone with people, and the content is repulsive to them. So, tracking your energy, seeing where that goes, can tell you a lot about your strengths. And I also recommend looking outside yourself. So,
Mm.
something that was really helpful for me when I was trying to find my entrepreneurial path, I lacked the confidence in what I had to offer. And so, in a moment of frustration, something I did was what I call now a DIY 360. If anyone here is from a traditional corporate environment, you're probably familiar with the 360, which is when you get feedback from people around you who see you in different domains of your work. As an entrepreneur, you may not have that as readily accessible to you, so you have to do it yourself. And so your DIY 360 is finding 5 to 7 people who know you well professionally, colleagues, partners, people you've met at conferences, things like that, and reaching out to them and asking them, what do you think my top 3 skills are? And what would you say is my number one strength? And it is really scary to do that. It
Yeah.
takes quite a bit of courage. But when you do that, you will get back such eye opening information. And sometimes it won't surprise you, but it will help ground you into, oh, the very things that I disregard in myself are the very things that others appreciate and find valuable about what I bring to the table. So it can really start to shift your lens about what you're best at.
Yeah, and it brings up a great point. One of the programs that we do with the center, an intern match program, we very specifically we accept resumes, and what we've noticed with the students is that it's very hard for them to talk through their skill sets and their strengths. And to your point, we've tried to do that exercise where it's like, yes, go out there, ask for others' opinions, because we always say that they can speak more to your strengths than you can internally and personally sometimes. And it's nice to have that just a different perspective, because you're so in it all the time.
Too close to it. Yes.
Yep. In the book, you talk about the biggest hangover you'll ever have in your life, and I'm curious to learn more.
So that refers to what I call the honor roll hangover, which my fellow former A+ gold star kids may resonate with, which is that idea that that high achievement personality, wanting to be the best at everything you do, wanting to get the A+, and really not having a moment where you're unproductive, can lead to carrying those behaviors over to the rest of your career. So, specifically, the honor roll hangover is a mix of perfectionism, that I need to get an A+ or else I'm a failure, or being very critical and self judgmental. So we have perfectionism, people pleasing, saying yes to every single request that comes your way, shifting your opinion. If other people disagree with it, you automatically cave, for example. And then over functioning, which is taking on more than your share of responsibility, either literally where you're taking on more work than you should be, than is actually yours.
Yeah.
You're rescuing people, you're fixing situations, or trying to assume responsibility and control for other people's emotions and reactions. So that's the honor roll hangover, is this idea of that work and achievement addiction that carries over into the rest of our professional lives.
Yeah. And can you share a little bit more about how do we really avoid that? How do we avoid getting into that saying yes to everything, or having to be, perfect at everything that we do?
Yeah, a couple things. In terms of not saying yes to everything, a few ideas here. First is to take stock of actually where you need better boundaries.
Yeah.
One way I talk about doing this in the book is using your emotions as a guide to assess and look at that data about the signals your emotions are trying to send to you. So, in particular, if you feel the emotion of resentment, that is a very strong emotional signal that you need a boundary, that you have let a situation go on for way too long without addressing it. So, for example, maybe you've been working with a client at a certain rate, and now you're starting to become very resentful of this. That is a good signal that it may be time to have a conversation about raising your prices, for example. In terms of saying no, wherever possible, I mean, no is a complete sentence, and it is fine just to say, I'm not able
Oh,
to
I
do
love
that.
that.
But better yet is to come to the table with some sort of alternate proposal or solution. So I'm not able to meet for coffee, or I'm not able to have this chat with you. What you can do is send me your number one question via email, for example. So you're offering an alternate solution, but it's on your terms. So you can straddle that line of being able to help someone without putting yourself out.
I love that. No is a complete sentence. That's really great. So this has been a difficult year for many founders, juggling work, homeschooling, you name it. Can you share some tips for setting that work-life boundary to beat the burnout and break that 24/7 work cycle that many of us, get stuck in?
You're absolutely right. And that is a trend I have seen, a troubling trend I have seen throughout my clients over the last year or 15 months, is that separation or lack of separation between work and life. Everything has just blended, and it's easy to work around the clock,
Yeah.
especially when you have this existential pressure of the pandemic and falling behind out there. So, a few simple things in order to set those end of day work boundaries, which disconnecting from work is so crucial. Having that internal and external boundary to say, okay, I'm shutting this off is very important for compartmentalizing it in your head, so you don't overthink after hours. What I recommend to my clients is a few things. First is picking a time when you are going to end your day. If that is 6 p.m., for many people it is, well, you have to be disciplined about not booking meetings over that, and making sure that you can actually end your day by 6 p.m., and getting comfortable with leaving some things unfinished. because that's the slippery slope that people get into, is that they say just one more thing, or I think I can finish this. And then all of a sudden it's 8, 9 p.m. and they're still not done with work. So picking a time at the end of the day, setting an alarm about 30 minutes before you want to wrap up, so it starts prompting you to get into your end of day ritual, which means you need an end of day ritual, a way that you are putting the cap on the end of the day, whether that's reflecting on 3 things that went well, planning the next day ahead, whatever it is that helps you feel like you are zeroing out and bringing closure to that day. Make it harder for yourself to go back to work. Turn off your laptop, log out of all your apps, take them off your phone, whatever it takes. I've had clients put their phone and their laptop in a different room, for example. And that little bit of friction can make the difference between going back to your laptop after dinner and not. And then have something to look forward to. The more you feel like there's something pulling you into your evening, something to look forward to, a reward, the more enticed you're going to be to do that and not go back to your work.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a big fan of, at the end of the day, creating a post-it note of like everything that I need to focus or prioritize for the next day. And that's been something super helpful, especially in this virtual environment. And, I know there's so many different tools that you can be doing on your phone and on your computer, but there's something about like being able to cross something off that feels really good once you're done completing it.
So satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah. This past year again has brought a lot of upheaval and change to many, with some exploring some new careers out of want and some really out of necessity and need. In the book, you write about what to do when you want to change everything or have to change everything. What are some things about when you are contemplating a big life change like that? What do you think about?
So similar to the energy tracking exercise I mentioned earlier, looking back, doing a career audit where you're looking back at your last 3 to 5 roles and really starting to examine, what did you like most about them? What did you like least about them? What do you wish you never had to do again? And this is very helpful for getting clear about what you do want more of or less of going into your next step. So having that clarity for yourself is really important so that you just don't fall into the next thing, for example. In the book, I also talk about turning your worry into fuel. So many times my clients, when they're wanting to make a big change, it is the fears and the doubts about, can I do this? Will I like this sort of work, that get in their way? So to the extent possible, look for ways you can design some sort of low stakes mini experiment. For example, if you're thinking about a new business, could you launch a beta service, a beta version of that product? Could you get one client in that area just to test it out and see if you like it? Could you shadow a friend or have informational interviews? All of that helps you validate whether your hypothesis is correct and helps you prove or disprove if that's a path that you want to go down. And then last, a very practical tip is refreshing your personal brand, making sure that your LinkedIn is up to date, that you have a nice headshot. I've had so many clients lately who have been creating personal websites, and that has actually been a linchpin in them getting selected for a role or for a business opportunity over someone else, because they are displaying themselves as a thought leader in that field and someone else is not.
That's amazing. That's really awesome. And for many, some of the things that have been traditionally been a bit easier to do in person seem a lot harder virtually. Do you have any thoughts on how to appear more assertive or confident over video in this new virtual environment that we're all navigating through?
Oh, yes. The elusive executive presence that everyone is trying to get, but no one knows quite how to define. So, yes, in this environment, how you appear on camera, I mean, it's one dimensional. So, we're working with different tools here.
Right.
So, yeah, a few things to keep in mind, of course, is your appearance. So that means, yes, physically your appearance, but also the framing of your camera. So you can tell here, I have my camera framed. I'm pretty nicely framed in the shot. My head isn't cut off. I'm not looking down at you. It's not, ultra selfie. And so making sure it looks like you're having a conversation with someone. Perhaps the most important and hardest behavior to practice is looking straight into the camera. So I'm looking at the camera lens right now, but if I look now, I'm looking at the Zoom screen, and it creates a totally different experience. That is a very hard behavior to train yourself into because it's unnatural. You want to look at the faces. So if you can put a Post-it note above your webcam that reminds you to look at that Post-it.
Look here.
Yes, exactly. And big arrows pointing there. Those are two of the most important tips. But I would say, particularly in group environments, learning the art of interrupting tactfully is important in this environment, again, because you can't as easily jump into a conversation. It's much more structured. So actually being able to assert yourself, to hop over someone, and you can do this by raising your hand, waiting for that moment of pause. I teach my clients something I call the baton strategy, which is looking at the agenda beforehand. And if there is an area that you want to contribute, let the meeting organizer know in advance so that when they get to that agenda item, they can pass the baton over to you and say, oh, Olivia has something she wanted to share. Olivia, why don't you chime in here? And it makes it that much easier for you to hop in.
Yeah, no, I love that. And especially I think that with Zoom, what we're noticing is that if there is an overlap, sometimes like it just mutes it doesn't mute essentially on the computer, but you can't really hear anyone who's speaking. And so there's that awkward of like, oh, were you going to say something? Was that you? And there's that awkward kind of a balance.
For sure.
So Melody, before we dive right into Q&A here, one final question for you here that we have listed is, what's next for you and your book?
What is next for me in the book is continuing to get it out there. I am on a mission to spread the word about sensitive strivers, to not only help people who are sensitive strivers become more empowered and confident in their work, but to help organizations understand this personality type and how to leverage them. So that is what is next for me.
Amazing. And I believe Olivia Wong, our production lead, will be dropping the link to Melody's book in the chat there. So in case you're interested in purchasing it, Olivia will drop that in there for you. We are going to go ahead and transition to Q&A. So if you do have questions for Melody, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. One of the questions we have listed here from Janet on the topic of sensitive strivers. She said, in what work environments do sensitive strivers best thrive? Having been an entrepreneur in a corporate, excessively role-based retail merchandising environment has become emotionally challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Janet. So this is a great question. And there is an entire chapter in the book about finding the right fit, finding the right environment for you. And in it, I talk about something I call the sensitive strivers hierarchy of needs. You might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which explains the sort of psychological and emotional needs that we as people have. This is a play on that describes, for sensitive strivers, what type of work environment do you need to be at your best? And so at the bottom of that pyramid, you do need to consider physical environment. So somewhere that is highly competitive, very fast paced, and even things, open floor plan. People are tapping your shoulder all day and interrupting you. There's constant meetings. That environment is not the best suited for sensitive strivers who really need structure, predictability to be at their best, but also downtime to reassess and regulate their nervous system, but to also think and allow those thoughts to percolate and synthesize. And of course, the pyramid goes up from there. But at the base level, I would be considering what are the physical needs you have for your actual workspace, and then what are the relational needs in terms of what type of coworker relationships, what do you need in terms of a culture to feel that there's psychological safety, that there's trust, and then build from there.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much for the question, Janet. Another question that we have for you is, how do you relay and connect with your instincts when making decisions?
Yes, I love this topic of gut instincts. In the book, I call it intuition, which, in my book, they're different names for the same thing. So whatever you want to call it, gut, uh, instincts, hunch, all the same thing. And what's fascinating is that we often think of this as a very woo-woo concept, but what we know is that intuition in psychology is defined by the pool of knowledge you have from your past experiences. So it's the same type of memory that it flows to you effortlessly without you having to put much conscious effort into it. So the fact that you know not to touch a hot stove because a hot stove is bad is actually an example of intuition.
Yeah.
And so for sensitive strivers, your intuition is such an underutilized resource because we have heightened awareness. So we're taking in more information, we're processing that, we're creating meaning from it at a deeper level. So your intuition tends to be much more refined, but we have the confidence challenge of believing it, of we tend to be the first one to undermine it as this is not worthwhile. I don't know what I'm talking about. My experience is not very good enough or is not good enough. So to really build up that muscle again, because it is a muscle, start by making small decisions with your intuition. And I mean very small. Pick a restaurant to go to without spending hours researching reviews online. Go for a walk and don't pick the exact route you're going to take, of course, with safety, of course. But practice honing your intuition and listening to your gut on those small choices so you can start to build the muscle and you can translate it to other areas. Two more things there, real quick. Number one, yes, number one is called the snap judgment test, which is a commonly used technique in psychology. Actually, there's a lot of studies on this idea of snap judgment. And of course, snap judgments in some situations are not good, right? There's a lot of mental shortcuts that we take. But listening to your intuition, especially when it comes to big, complicated life choices, it's shown that combining your intuition, your gut sense with logic is much more effective. So, the snap judgment test, if you are someone who is struggling with a difficult question, a city you want to move to, or taking a new opportunity, for example, write that question down on a paper, put a pen near it, and walk away for a couple of hours. Come back to it and force yourself within 5 seconds to circle either yes or no. So on that paper, you will have written yes or no. And that exercise will reveal to you your intuitive choice. It may not be one you like, but it's going to be good data about what your gut says. And then last is creating that space for processing. So many times, the business owners I work with, their day is back to back to back to back to back meetings, and there is no time for reflection or space to just be. And intuition cannot thrive in that sort of environment. It's a totally different mode of thinking. One is a very focused mode of thinking, which is how we spend most of our time, and intuition is more diffuse. And so we need to be creating that downtime. And, personally, I do it by creating 15, 20-minute buffers in between all of my appointments, for example. That's one very easy way to create that space for yourself.
Yeah. Something we tried practicing at the center was a no meeting Wednesday. We were so stacked from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They were like, oh, there's just no time in the week to get like the work that we needed to get done or to have the spaciousness to just think and design and ideate. And we had come up with no meeting Wednesday. And it was always my favorite day of the week, right? It was the day that I knew that I was like, oh, I'm going to get so much work done. I'm going to be able to think and process. And it's very different. I mean, even with sometimes working in those breaks, having a meeting in between it kind of just, you have to stop what you're thinking about, join that meeting, reprocess everything, and then try to jump back into it. And it takes time to get back into that flow. And so I love the idea of creating that spaciousness.
Yes, exactly.
One of the questions that we have come in, it said, how should one respond to a colleague saying you are too sensitive?
Great question and very common. And so I'm going to assume that this is said with derisively, that it is not a compliment like, oh my gosh, you're too sensitive. Um, it is said as stop being so sensitive. And what I would say is more times than not to directly acknowledge the sensitivity component because someone means it as a dig. So the best thing you can do is actually refocus the conversation on the topic at hand. If someone says, well, you're being so sensitive about this, you can say, I understand that may be how you're perceiving it. What I want to do is get back to the issue at hand. What are we going to do about this service launch that we have coming up? Right? So don't go down that route of getting into tit for tat of how could you say that about me? I'm not being too sensitive here. You're being too sensitive here.
Yeah.
And rather just rise above and redirect the conversation back to the topic at hand.
Helpful. Super, super helpful. Another question that we've had come in here. Without being aggressive, how would you set boundaries with consultants who are sensitive?
Without being aggressive, how would you set boundaries with consultants who are sensitive? Well, I would say a general principle about boundaries is wherever possible, let the person know what is in it for them. So, for example, if you need this person to get a deliverable to you by a certain time frame, that's your boundary, right? My boundary is I need this by 12 p.m. on Tuesdays going forward. How does it benefit them to follow through on that? The other person. It may mean greater efficiencies. It may mean that your customers are happier, for example. So, wherever possible, look for what's in it for them. What I would say.
Great. Great. And one of the questions that actually came through some of the pre-submitted questions that we received, and something I'm super curious about is how do you handle family dynamics in a workplace?
Mm-hmm. I see this a lot. You'd be surprised. I work with many entrepreneurs who are family business owners, and there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that because the boundaries are blurred, right? And it can be very hard. One thing I see entrepreneurs struggle with the most in this is that they still feel like the son who used to work in the business when they were 13, right? And maybe their parent ran it before. So, one of the most helpful tactics, especially if both family members or multiple family members are still actively in the business. So, for example, I worked with once a client who she was the founder of the company, but her partner in the business was her mother. And that was very complicated because she was managing her mom. It's a very complicated dynamic. And so one thing that was very useful for her was very explicitly defining when she had her CEO hat on and when she had her daughter hat on. And literally that was a tool that we worked with her on with her mom to say, mom, right now I have my CEO hat on. And what I need from you is to be making this many sales calls during the week. Or mom, right now I have my daughter hat on and I see you're feeling really stressed out. What can we do here? So being very explicit about your role, since it can change, is all the more important when you have a family business and the lines are blurred.
Awesome. Super, super helpful. And another question here, how do you overcome the fear of making mistakes?
Yes, which for sensitive strivers, right, that perfectionist in us thinks that is akin to failure, right? But a mistake is not a failure. A mistake is learning. It's data. I know it's hard to believe that in the moment, but also important to keep in mind that there's something called the spotlight effect, which leads us to amplify and almost like there's a spotlight shining on our inadequacies and mistakes and not other people. But what we need to realize is that other people have their own spotlights. So many times, the things that you think are major mistakes and screw ups that people are going to judge you for, they're not even aware of what's going on. So that perspective taking tool can be very helpful. But also with mistakes, what you need to separate is what happened versus what am I making this mean about me? And that's a very powerful coaching question. What am I making this mean about me? Because we often make mistakes mean I'm a failure. I am never going to succeed in business. We tell ourselves all these stories. So catching yourself in that story, reframing it, telling yourself a different one, that by and far is the most important thing you can do when you encounter something that didn't go as you planned.
Yeah. Yeah. And what are some strategies for decision making when you have so much going on, when you have a ton of things on your plate?
Yes. So sensitive strivers tend to be very prone to overthinking, which
Yeah.
is thinking too much about something, making the decision process overly complex. This is where constraints come in, especially when you have a lot going on. Constraints are your friend. We may think that it makes things more difficult for us, but it actually provides parameters and bumpers for our thinking. So pick a date, pick a deadline by when you want to make a decision. Let somebody else know who is waiting on this choice when you're going to have it to them by, so you start creating some accountability for yourself.
Yeah.
Limit time box the amount of time you allow yourself to spend researching and deliberating. Limit the amount of resources or different vendors or stakeholders or subject matter experts you consult. By putting those constraints on something, you make sure that you keep your decision making tidy rather than letting it spiral out of control.
Great. That's helpful. Thank you. And how can you use sensitivity and emotions as an asset when working to build client relationships?
Mhm. This comes back to that empathy and entering their situation. I'll tell you one quick story where I had a client during the pandemic. Their entire business model was flipped on its head. They provided in person classes. And when the pandemic came around, that was not possible anymore. So they had to pivot very quickly.
Yeah.
As part of this client, who was a more senior person at their organization, um, they were dealing with a very disgruntled client who nobody wanted to touch. This client, they were the biggest pain in the butt. No one wanted to go near them, and they were just trying to write him off. And this client went above and beyond to fly out to see this person, and again, safely, of course, because he knew that what that person needed was a human connection, and that what that person needed was to not be boxed into, okay, this is how things are going to be done going forward. This is our new business model, but needed to have a conversation and to hash things out and to have something that was more customized. So because my client was sensitive, because he could read between the lines of what someone was saying and what they really wanted, because he understands human emotions and what people need when they're angry or upset, he was able to completely turn that relationship around and turn that into their highest paying account to date. So that's an example of what's possible when you actually leverage these qualities for good.
That's really awesome. That's such a great story to share. And what do you know now that you wish you knew that when you were younger?
What I wish I could go back and tell my younger self is to not put off once in a lifetime moments for work that can be done tomorrow. If you read the book, I tell a story in the introduction about how I really allowed my work addiction to carry me away and was really letting my fear and insecurities drive all of my decisions to the detriment of the rest of my life. And
Yeah.
that is one lesson I took away from that time period, is that work that can be done tomorrow can be done tomorrow, and that there are once in a lifetime moments that will pass you by in the blink of an eye if you don't take advantage of them.
I couldn't agree more. And well, Melody, we're really coming up on time here, and I've certainly learned so much myself, took some notes myself, tips that I'm going to pull away from this. Any final words of advice that you'd like to leave the audience with us today with?
I hope that all of you are starting to understand and see that your sensitivity, your ambition are your greatest gifts when they are leveraged correctly. So please use them for the assets they are, not only for your own advancement, but for to make an impact on everybody else around you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Melody, so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to the community, share your insights, your tips. You set such a great overview. On behalf of the NASDAQ Entrepreneur Center and everyone in attendance today, we sincerely thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks, Melody. And for those of you who are still with us, we'd love for you to join us for upcoming webinars. We have one tomorrow, June 23rd, Product Market Fit with Pavan. And then we have one on Monday, June 28th, No One Succeeds Alone with Robert Refkin, the CEO of Compass. Again, if you are looking to purchase Melody's book, we'll drop it in there in the chat for you. If you can take a moment to fill out that survey for us, that will help us get a better understanding of what programs we should be standing up in the future. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back online with us soon.